I never thought fatherhood would come to this. A cold silence between me and my only son. The dining table, where I once sat across from him helping with homework, now feels like a graveyard of memories. My name is David, and I'm 58 years old. I worked hard my entire life to provide for my family, never imagining that one day my own blood would see me as nothing more than a wallet. It all began with the announcement of his wedding. At first I was thrilled. My son Michael had finally found the woman he wanted to spend his life with. I imagined the father-son moment every parent dreams of, walking him through advice, sharing laughs while tasting cake samples, raising a toast on the big day. But that vision shattered the moment he sat me down and said words that cut deeper than any knife. "Dad, it might be better if you don't come to the wedding." I laughed at first, thinking it was a poor joke. Who bans their own father from such a milestone? But the look in his eyes wasn't joking. He shifted uncomfortably in his chair, explaining that his fiancée and her family wanted a certain image, and that my presence didn't fit. I asked him what that meant, and he dodged with vague excuses about keeping things simple and avoiding drama. My heart sank as I realized he had chosen their approval over my love. For days after, I replayed the conversation in my head. How could he erase me from his story so easily, had I not been there through scraped knees, late-night study sessions, the first heartbreak? Had I not worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, to pay for his college, to give him the very life he was about to celebrate without me? It felt like my entire role as a father had been erased with one careless decision. But the true blow came weeks later. A letter arrived in the mail, thick envelope with his handwriting on the front. I tore it open, hoping maybe it was an apology, an invitation, a change of heart. Instead, I found a neatly typed invoice, an actual bill, $90,000. My son had not invited me to his wedding, but he had the audacity to send me the bill for it. Venue, catering, flowers, honeymoon, all itemized like a business transaction. At the bottom, a note in his handwriting. "Dad, this is the least you can do for me. After all, you owe me that much." I sat there in disbelief, staring at the paper until the numbers blurred. $90,000. More than I had ever seen sitting in one place at any time in my life. I felt anger rise in me, hot and sharp, mixing with sorrow that weighed heavier than any financial burden. He hadn't just shut me out of his wedding. He reduced me to an ATM, a faceless provider who should quietly pay for a life I wasn't even welcome to witness. That night, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and sat alone in the dark. Memories of him as a child flooded my mind. His tiny hand in mine, his laughter echoing through the yard as we played catch, the pride in his eyes when he showed me his first A+ report card. I wondered where that little boy had gone. When had he turned into this stranger who saw me not as a father, but as a bank account? As the hours passed, one thought crystallized in my mind. Maybe this wasn't just about the wedding. Maybe this was the culmination of years of entitlement, years where I gave too much and demanded too little. Maybe I had raised him to believe love came with a price tag, and now he was cashing in. I didn't respond to the invoice right away. I kept it folded on my desk, staring at it every night like it might suddenly explain itself. $90,000. The arrogance of it haunted me. Each time I looked at that paper, it reminded me of the countless sacrifices I had made for him. I thought about the overtime shifts I pulled at the factory, the weekends I gave up so he could have a better chance than I ever did. And now here he was, demanding money for a party I wasn't even allowed to attend. A week later, the phone rang. His voice was casual, almost businesslike. "Dad, did you get the letter?" I swallowed the bitterness in my throat and answered simply, "Yes, I got it." He didn't even pause before pressing forward. "Good. So when can you transfer the money? We need to put down the deposit on the honeymoon suite." My grip on the phone tightened. Honeymoon suite. That's what this was about. He wasn't calling me as a son reaching out to a father. He was calling as a man securing a transaction. I asked him if he realized what he was saying to me. He brushed it off. "Dad, it's not that big of a deal. You've always provided. You can cover this too. Besides, you'll feel good knowing you helped us start our future." His words were like acid, each syllable erasing years of love and replacing it with cold entitlement. I took a deep breath, fighting the urge to explode. "Michael," I said, my voice steady but firm, "you told me I'm not welcome at your wedding. Do you really think you can erase me from your life but still use my bank account?" He sighed impatiently, like I was being unreasonable. "You don't understand. This isn't about you being there. It's about support. That's what parents are supposed to do. Support their children." Support. That word echoed in my mind long after we hung up. Hadn't I supported him his entire life? When he broke his leg in high school football, I slept on the hospital couch for a week, refusing to leave his side. When his first car broke down, I skipped paying one of my bills to help him fix it. When he failed his first year of college, I told him not to give up and covered his tuition again. Support wasn't new to me. But this was exploitation dressed as expectation. Days turned into weeks, and pressure built from his side. He sent texts reminding me of deadlines. He emailed spreadsheets breaking down costs as if this was a corporate deal I was obligated to fund. I stayed silent, torn between rage and heartbreak. Friends I confided in told me to cut him off completely, to let him fall flat. But it's never that simple when it's your own child. Love doesn't just vanish, no matter how deep the betrayal. Then one evening, as I sat in my living room surrounded by unpaid bills of my own, it hit me. Maybe this was the moment I had to stop enabling him. Maybe the cruelest kindness I could give was the one that felt hardest. To teach him that love is not measured in dollars. That a father's worth isn't tied to his wallet, and yet I couldn't deny the anger boiling inside me. He had stripped me of dignity by excluding me from his wedding. Now he was trying to strip me of respect by demanding money. I decided I wouldn't scream or beg, I wouldn't lecture him. Instead, I would show him what it meant when you tried to reduce a father to nothing more than a bank account. Revenge wasn't the word I used in my mind. It was more like justice. A chance to turn the mirror toward him and let him see exactly who he had become. If he wanted a lesson, I was going to give him one he would never forget. The days after our last conversation felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I kept thinking about that dining table where I'd once eaten with my son, laughing over simple meals, watching him grow from a boy into a man. Now it stood as a reminder of what had broken between us. Family, once a bond, had become a battlefield. Mark's words replayed in my head on a loop. "It's our day, not yours." The cruelty of it cut deeper than I wanted to admit. Weddings are supposed to bring families together. Instead, this one was being built on exclusion. I wanted to believe he was being influenced, pushed into this by Anna and her family. But at the end of the day, those words came from his mouth. That was what hurt the most. I busied myself with small routines to avoid dwelling on the emptiness. Mornings with coffee on the porch, evenings reading the newspaper I hardly absorbed. Nights were the worst. The silence after the lights went out pressed down hard. Do you know that feeling when you're surrounded by quiet, yet your mind won't stop screaming? That was my reality. I kept asking myself, how did we end up here? What mistakes had I made as a father to bring us to this point? One Saturday, I passed the community park where Mark had once played soccer as a child. I stood at the fence watching another group of kids chase the ball, their parents cheering wildly from the sidelines. For a moment I remembered myself standing there years ago, proud of every move he made, rain or shine, shouting encouragement until my voice gave out. And then it hit me like a punch. How quickly loyalty fades when people forget the sacrifices you made for them. It wasn't about the money, though his demand had insulted me deeply. $90,000 isn't pocket change. It represents decades of hard work, long hours, missed vacations, and every bit of security I'd built for my retirement. But worse than that was the idea he saw me as nothing more than a bank account. Not a father, not family, just a source of cash. That realization turned my grief into something else. Resolve. I started to think differently. If Mark and Anna wanted to play this game, then I would choose my moves carefully. I wasn't going to grovel or argue anymore. I wasn't going to explain myself in desperate phone calls that went unanswered. Instead, I was going to let them reveal exactly who they were to everyone else. Sometimes the most powerful revenge doesn't come from what you say, but from what you don't. Silence can be sharper than words. That evening, I opened the drawer where I kept old letters and photos. I pulled out the picture of Mark at his high school graduation. Cap tilted, grin wide. I held it for a long time, my chest tight with conflicting emotions. Love doesn't vanish overnight, even when it's battered. But respect, that's different. Respect once lost is almost impossible to rebuild. And I realized, painfully, that I didn't respect the man my son had become. As I sat there in the dim light, a new thought formed. Maybe he needed this lesson more than I needed the comfort of being included. Maybe the best way to respond wasn't to fight my way back into his world, but to step aside and let him feel the consequences of his own choices. He wanted independence, he wanted control. Let him have it, but not at my expense. With that decision came an unexpected calm. For the first time since the chaos began, I felt a sense of control returning. The storm wasn't over, not by a long shot, but I finally understood how I would face it. Not with anger, not with pleading, but with a steady, unshakable resolve. Let him think I was broken. Let him think I was defeated. The truth was, I was just getting started. The following week, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. I knew the handwriting before I even picked it up, Mark's neat, deliberate strokes. My hands hesitated as I held it, a small part of me hoping it was an apology. Maybe he had reconsidered. Maybe he remembered who had raised him, who had stood in his corner for decades. But hope is a dangerous thing. When I tore it open, there was no apology. Instead, there was a printed invoice, neat and itemized, totaling exactly $90,000. Wedding costs, honeymoon expenses, venue deposits, photographer fees, even flowers. At the bottom, in cold black ink, a note. Please send payment promptly. Consider it your contribution as my father. I sat at the dining table staring at that paper, my chest tightening. I had built my entire life on that table. Family dinners, late-night homework sessions, birthday cakes with candles burning low. And now it was the place where my son's betrayal sat staring back at me in numbers. Have you ever looked at something so absurd, so insulting, that your body doesn't even know how to react? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because laughter was the only thing keeping me from breaking down. That laugh turned bitter fast. $90,000 wasn't a request. It was a demand, dressed up in polite words. It was a declaration that my value as a father had been reduced to a line item on a budget. I thought of all the times I had sacrificed for him, the weekends I spent fixing up his car instead of resting, the nights I stayed awake worrying about his grades, his health, his future. All of that had led to this moment where he treated me like a wallet with legs. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Not to pay, not to file away, but to remember. That piece of paper had told me more about my son than his words ever could, and it gave me clarity. I wasn't going to fight for a seat at his wedding. I wasn't going to chase him down for approval. Instead, I was going to use the truth he handed me to protect myself. If Mark saw me only as money, then he was about to find out what it meant when that money disappeared. The very next day, I scheduled a meeting with my attorney. I explained the situation, showed him the invoice, and laid out the history leading up to it. He shook his head, almost in disbelief. "I've seen divorces uglier than this," he said, "but your own son sending you a bill. That's new. His advice was simple: protect my assets, put everything in order, and be ready for the fallout. Walking out of that law office, I felt something shift inside me. The grief was still there, heavy and raw, but alongside it came a spark of determination. I wasn't going to let myself be manipulated or humiliated. Not by Anna, not by her family, and not by my own son. They thought I was weak, that I would cave under the weight of guilt and pressure. But they had underestimated me. That evening, I poured myself a drink and sat by the window, the city lights glowing faintly in the distance. For the first time in weeks, I felt steady. Revenge wasn't going to be loud or messy. It was going to be precise. It was going to be quiet. And it was going to hit exactly where it hurt most. Sometimes the best revenge isn't about shouting your truth. It's about letting the silence and your actions speak louder than any words could. As I set the glass down, I whispered to myself, almost as a promise, if they want to see me as nothing more than money, then money is exactly what they'll lose. And with that, the plan began to form. The invoice sat tucked in my desk drawer, but its weight lingered in every thought I carried. I refused to crumble under it. If Mark wanted to see me as a source of endless funds, then he needed to learn that cutting off a father's respect comes with a price. I spent the next few days reviewing every detail of my finances, moving things quietly into safer accounts, securing assets that I had built over decades. I wasn't going to be reckless. I was going to be smart. During those long nights, memories swarmed in uninvited. I remembered Mark's first bicycle. He had fallen 3 times before he managed to stay balanced, tears running down his cheeks. I had jogged beside him until he found his strength, until he looked at me with pride shining in his young eyes. That same boy was now asking me to bankroll a wedding I wasn't even welcome to attend. Isn't it strange how life twists? The very child who once leaned on my hand for support was now pushing me away while reaching into my pocket. I realized then that this wasn't just about money. It was about dignity. It was about drawing a line that had never been drawn before. For years, I had made sacrifices quietly, swallowing disappointments, trying to keep peace. But peace built on silence is nothing more than surrender, and I was done surrendering. One evening, Anna's father called me. His voice was polite, but his tone carried a smugness that stung. We just wanted to check if the payment will be arriving soon. The vendors are waiting. I gripped the phone tighter, forcing myself to stay calm. I'm not paying for a wedding I wasn't invited to, I said evenly. There was a pause, then a condescending laugh. Well, Mark told us you'd be difficult. We'll manage without you, but I suppose he'll remember your absence. That single sentence said everything. They had already written me off, already painted me as the villain in their narrative. For them, I wasn't family. I was leverage. And hearing it out loud didn't break me. It hardened me. Later that night, I sat down with my journal and wrote, if they've chosen to turn me into the enemy, then I will wear that role with pride, but I'll play it on my terms. Writing it down made it real. It made the anger sharp but controlled, no longer scattered. The next morning, I declined a call from Mark. Let him stew in silence. Let him wonder why his demands weren't being met. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control returning. Silence was my new weapon. I wasn't going to explain, justify, or argue. My refusal would speak louder than any debate. That weekend, I attended a small dinner hosted by an old friend. The warmth of real companionship, the easy laughter, the way people asked about my life without expecting a check. All of it reminded me of what family should feel like, and it made me realize something crucial. I wasn't as alone as I thought. Blood may bind, but respect is what makes people stand by you. When I returned home that night, I sat at my dining table, the same one where I had opened Mark's invoice, and whispered to myself, "You don't get to decide my worth. Not anymore." The plan was no longer just forming, it was solidifying. I wasn't going to be a victim in this story. If my son wanted me erased from his wedding, then I'd show him what it meant to erase my support from his life. I poured myself a drink, raised the glass toward the empty chair across from me, and said softly, "Here's to freedom, the kind money can't buy." And in that quiet toast, I found the strength to move forward. Days turned into weeks, and the silence from my side became its own statement. I didn't respond to Mark's follow-up messages. I didn't reply to Anna's emails, which came typed in clipped sentences, all about deadlines and deposits. I let them pile up in my inbox like junk mail, each one a reminder of how little they valued me as a person. For once, I wasn't going to explain myself. I wasn't going to defend my choice. I was simply going to live it. One evening, after work, I found another envelope waiting at my door. This time, it wasn't Mark's handwriting. It was a printed letterhead from a vendor. Apparently, the photographer had been told I was the one covering his bill. Reading those words, I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping. They hadn't just disrespected me. They had built their entire plan on the assumption that I would bend, that I would cave because that's what I had always done. That assumption was their mistake. I spent that night drafting a different kind of letter. It wasn't angry. It wasn't pleading. It was clear. I wrote directly to Mark. "You chose to exclude me. That was your decision. You don't get to exclude me and then expect my support. Consider this final. I will not be paying for your wedding nor for your honeymoon. I wish you both luck, but you will not fund that luck with my labor." I didn't send it right away. I wanted to make sure the tone was right, firm but not cruel. In the end, I slipped it into an envelope and mailed it the next morning. As it left my hands, I felt lighter. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the chains of obligation begin to fall away. When Mark finally called, his voice was sharp, tinged with anger he didn't bother to hide. "Dad, what are you doing? Do you realize how much pressure this puts on us?" I listened quietly, letting him get it all out. His words stung, but beneath the anger, I heard something else. Panic. For once, he wasn't in control. I took a deep breath before answering. "Mark, I've supported you your entire life. But support isn't a right. It's a gift, and you don't get to throw me away one day and then demand my help the next." There was silence on the other end, heavy and tense. Then he muttered, "Anna's furious. She says you're embarrassing us." I almost laughed at that. Me embarrassing them? After everything? If standing my ground embarrasses you, then maybe it's time you ask yourself why. The call ended without resolution, but I didn't need one. I had spoken my truth, and I had no intention of retreating. That weekend, I sat at a cafe downtown, watching couples stroll by, hand in hand. They looked ordinary, unburdened by the kind of drama I was wading through. And I thought to myself, respect is the only true currency in a family. Without it, all the shared meals, all the photos, all the holidays mean nothing. When I returned home, I placed Mark's invoice and my rejection letter side by side on the table. Two pieces of paper that told the story of our broken bond. One was a demand, cold and entitled. The other was a refusal, quiet but resolute. Together, they marked the line I had finally drawn. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself asking the question I had avoided all along. Was this the end of my relationship with my son? The answer hurt, but it was also clear. Sometimes endings are the only way to protect what little of yourself you have left. And so, I whispered into the dark more to myself than anyone else. If this is what it takes to reclaim my dignity, then so be it. And for the first time in months, I fell asleep without tears. The days following that phone call were strangely quiet. No letters, no emails, no more voicemails from Mark demanding explanations. For a brief moment, I thought perhaps he had finally understood. But silence, I've learned, often hides storms brewing just out of sight. It was a Thursday evening when my phone buzzed with a notification, a social media tag. Curious, I opened the app and there it was. Anna's post. A glossy photo of her in a white gown, standing beside Mark in a designer suit captioned, "Can't wait for our dream wedding, thanks to everyone making this possible. True family shows up when it matters." My stomach clenched. Beneath the post were dozens of comments congratulating them, many from relatives who knew very well what had been going on. And then I saw it. Subtle digs, thinly veiled comments. "So glad you have real support around you." Some people just don't understand sacrifice. I didn't need a name to know those barbs were aimed at me. For a long time, I sat there staring at the glowing screen, torn between anger and sadness. To have my son weaponize family in public, to let Anna cast me as the villain for their audience, it was a betrayal layered on top of all the others. That night I wrote in my journal, a habit I'd taken up to process the madness. They want me to feel small. They want me to feel guilty. But guilt only works when you believe you're wrong. I closed the book with steady hands. A week later, a thick envelope arrived, this time from Mark's lawyer. My breath caught as I slid it open. Inside was a formal letter, stating that since I had verbally promised to support them financially, they were prepared to pursue legal measures to enforce payment. Legal measures? For refusing to bankroll a wedding I wasn't even invited to? I sat at my dining table, the same table where I'd once eaten meals with him, where laughter had once filled the air, and read those words again and again. A son threatening his own father with lawyers over money. It was almost surreal. But instead of panic, something else rose within me, clarity. They were playing their hand, and it was a weak one. I picked up the phone and called my attorney, a man I had worked with years earlier during a property dispute. He listened quietly as I explained, then chuckled. "They don't have a case. You owe them nothing. Let them bluster." That reassurance steadied me. For so long I had felt like I was on trial in the court of my own family's judgment. But now, for the first time, I realized the truth. They had no power except the power I gave them. Over the following days, I heard from cousins, from siblings, even from an old family friend. Each call carried the same tone: confusion, disappointment, thinly veiled pressure. "Why not just help them, Robert? It's only money. Don't you want to see your son happy?" And with each call, I gave the same calm response. Happiness built on exploitation isn't happiness at all. The words became easier to say each time, like a shield I was finally learning to lift. I stopped justifying myself, stopped offering explanations. I let the facts speak. He chose to exclude me. He chose entitlement, and I chose dignity. One evening I stood by the window watching the city lights flicker in the distance, and I asked myself a hard question. Had I already lost my son long before this wedding? Maybe the truth was that I had been losing him in pieces for years, and this brutal demand was simply the final cut. The thought hurt, but it also freed me. Because once you accept what is gone, you stop fighting to get it back. And sometimes, that acceptance is the first step toward real peace. The wedding day arrived not with fanfare for me, but with an eerie stillness. No invitation had come, no olive branch, not even a courtesy call. I knew where it was being held, a luxury vineyard estate, the kind of place meant to dazzle with chandeliers and champagne fountains. Word had spread quickly through family, friends, and even neighbors. Everyone was talking about how spectacular it would be, how Anna had spared no expense. But for me, the silence of my house was louder than any orchestra. I thought about ignoring it all, burying myself in work, letting the day pass unnoticed. But curiosity has a way of scratching at the edges of resolve. Around noon, I found myself driving past the venue, not to crash the event, but to see from a distance what kind of fairy tale they thought they were living without me. The parking lot was packed with expensive cars. Guests in polished suits and shimmering dresses streamed toward the gates, laughter floating in the air. Through the iron fence I caught glimpses of flashing cameras, white floral arches, and waiters carrying trays of sparkling drinks. It was beautiful, undeniably so. And yet, it all felt hollow to me, like a stage play where the script was written to erase me entirely. As I stood there, a mix of emotions welled up. Sadness, yes, but also a strange kind of relief. I didn't belong to that world anymore. They had chosen their story, one that painted me as unnecessary, inconvenient. And I had chosen mine, one where I no longer begged for scraps of inclusion. I drove home before the ceremony even began. There was no point in lingering, no need to torture myself by imagining every detail. Instead, I poured a glass of wine, sat on the porch, and let the evening sun warm my face. For once, I wasn't pacing floors or checking my phone for updates. I was simply still. Later that night, photos started appearing online. Mark in his tailored tuxedo, Anna beaming in her gown, relatives grinning as if they were part of a royal affair. Comments flooded in. The perfect day. Such a beautiful couple. A wedding to remember. I stared at the screen, half expecting a pang of jealousy or bitterness. But what I felt was something different. Detachment. Those smiles, those toasts, those staged embraces, they weren't mine to envy. They were the carefully curated illusions of people desperate to look flawless to the world, even if it meant erasing the truth behind the curtain. Then came the twist I hadn't expected. A message landed in my inbox from one of the guests who had been there. It was short, almost hesitant. Robert, I don't know what really happened between you and Mark, but the way Anna spoke about you in her toast, it wasn't kind. She said you were selfish, that you abandoned him, that he built his life in spite of you. I thought you should know. I read those words over and over, my chest tightening. It wasn't enough to exclude me. They had rewritten the narrative entirely, casting me as the villain, the absent father who had never cared. My blood boiled, but underneath the anger was something sharper. Resolve. If that was the story they wanted the world to believe, I wasn't going to sit quietly and let it stand. That night, I opened my journal again and wrote, "They erased me today, but tomorrow, I begin making sure the truth has its voice. My voice." And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a man left behind. I felt like a man standing at the edge of a new beginning, one where I would decide how the story ends, not them. The morning after the wedding, I woke with a weight pressing on my chest. Not sadness exactly, but a heaviness that comes when you realize you've been written out of your own story. They hadn't just excluded me. They had twisted the truth until I was unrecognizable, painting me as selfish, cold, and uncaring. And now their version of me was being toasted with champagne flutes and applauded by strangers. For years, I had avoided conflict, telling myself silence was the higher ground. But silence, I realized, was what gave them room to rewrite me. If I didn't speak, if I didn't act, then their lies would harden into history. And I wasn't willing to let my own son believe a story built on deceit. I started small. I wrote a letter, not angry, not defensive, but measured. I recounted birthdays I had paid for, trips I had arranged, nights I had stayed up when Mark was sick as a child. I wrote about the soccer games, the science projects, the endless sacrifices that parents make quietly in the background. I wasn't writing to the world, I was writing to him. And then I sent it, not to Mark directly, but to a handful of relatives who had always claimed neutrality. If whispers had power at a wedding, then the truth deserved to travel just as far. The responses came quickly. Some were awkward, polite acknowledgments. Others were colder. "Robert, maybe it's time to let go." But one stood out. My sister-in-law replied with a message I hadn't expected. "I knew something wasn't right when Anna spoke last night. I don't agree with how they treated you. If you need someone to back up your side, I will." It was the first sign that cracks existed in the shiny facade they had built. Emboldened, I did something I never thought I'd do. I told my story publicly, not on social media with rants or accusations, but in a carefully written essay for a local community blog. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. I simply wrote about what it feels like to be erased by your own family, to watch a narrative unfold where your existence is reduced to an obstacle. The piece went viral in ways I couldn't have predicted. Hundreds of comments poured in. People shared their own experiences of being excluded from weddings, birthdays, even funerals. Messages arrived from strangers who thanked me for putting into words what they had felt but never dared to say. And though Mark and Anna might have pretended it had nothing to do with them, I knew they had seen it. The timing was too sharp, too pointed. Days later, another message arrived. This time it was from Mark himself. His tone was clipped, his words chosen with care. "Dad, I saw what you wrote. I don't appreciate being made into a spectacle. This was supposed to be my day, not about you." I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers hovered over the keys. There was a temptation to fire back with anger, to remind him that he had made me invisible long before I ever spoke out. But instead, I typed only this: "You made your day about lies. I made mine about truth. You'll have to live with your version. I'll live with mine." I hit send and sat back, feeling the tension drain from me. For the first time in months, I wasn't the man begging for inclusion. I wasn't the father waiting by the phone for scraps of acknowledgement. I was someone reclaiming his voice, his dignity. And here's the part I never expected. The support didn't stop. People I hadn't spoken to in years reached out, offering encouragement, sharing how my words had given them courage in their own fractured families. My inbox became a strange sort of lifeline. A reminder that even when your own blood turns its back, you are never truly alone. That night, I closed my journal with one final note. The story isn't finished, not until I decide it is. Because this wasn't about revenge in the loud, dramatic sense. This was about something quieter, something more lasting. It was about refusing to let lies be the final word. And if Mark thought I would fade quietly into the background, he was about to learn that some fathers don't vanish. They rise. Weeks went by after that last bitter exchange with Mark, and the silence that followed hit me harder than I expected. At first, I kept replaying his words in my head, hearing the coldness, the way he made me feel like my truth didn't matter. It stung, it burned, and it sat in my chest like a heavy stone. But slowly, that stone began to shift. The silence that had once felt like punishment started to feel like freedom. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for his approval. I wasn't waiting for anyone at all. I began to rebuild my days. Sunday mornings became mine again, no longer consumed by family obligations or guilt. I took long walks through the park, breathing in the cool air, letting myself remember that life still had beauty. Evenings that once ended with me crying in silence now ended with dinners alongside friends who actually valued me, who didn't measure my worth against impossible standards. And that infamous $90,000 bill? The one meant to insult me, to remind me of where I supposedly failed? I never paid it. I never shredded it. Instead, I framed it. It hangs on the wall above my desk like a trophy, a reminder not of loss, but of survival. Every time I look at it, I see proof that I refused to be broken, proof that I turned what was meant to crush me into a symbol of freedom. Because revenge doesn't always look like shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it's quieter. Sometimes it's refusing to fall apart when they expect you to. Sometimes it's walking away with your dignity intact and letting their choices haunt them instead of you. I know what you might be wondering. Did Mark ever regret it? Did Anna ever realize what she did? Maybe one day they'll feel the weight of their actions, or maybe they won't. And you know what? I'm finally okay with either outcome, because their remorse, or lack of it, no longer controls my life. I've learned that I'm not defined by the invitations I don't receive, or the tables I'm not welcome to sit at. I'm defined by the resilience I've built, the courage it took to face rejection head-on, and the strength to carve out my own space when no one offered me one. So here's my truth. I'm not bitter anymore. I'm resolved. I choose myself. I choose peace. I choose to build a life that has nothing to do with their lies, their games, or their cruelty. And that choice, my choice, is something no one can ever take away from me. And to anyone listening who has ever felt like the outsider, who has been excluded, rejected, or told you weren't enough, I want you to hear this clearly. Your worth isn't decided by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes the sweetest revenge isn't fire and fury. It's simply living well, living fully, and refusing to disappear. If you're still here with me, thank you. Maybe you've seen yourself in this story. Maybe you've carried scars that no one else understands. If so, I'd love to hear from you. Share your story in the comments below because your voice matters. Hit that like button if this journey resonated with you, and subscribe to join me for more stories where pain turns into power and betrayal finds its consequence. This isn't just the end of a story, it's the beginning of a life I'm proud of. And that, my friends, is the quietest and most powerful revenge of all.